Good evening and welcome to the August 31st meeting of the Planning Policy Commission. Tonight we have the honor of doing something we usually don't do, and that's have two public hearings. The first is on a proposal addition from what we've already approved for adding structured parking to buildings. And this, tonight we're going to talk about the school district. And so I'm just going to open up for discussion. If there's, the proposal is to add, like our other proposals, 50% structured parking. Any discussion? Any?
Yes, I have discussion. Is this on? Yes. Okay, so I'd like to make a recommendation that all new public schools shall provide 95% of the required parking structure, and that when a parking structure is built, that it provides covered parking for bicycles and e-bicycles unless there's already covered parking for bicycles. So two recommendations I'm posing: 95% structured parking and covered parking for bicycles.
I would love to hear from staff as to why they settled on the 50%, and if that was just the directive that we had given, the recommendation we had given council, and that they had settled on previous structured parking, or how you guys came to this number specifically for schools.
Why don't we let Jennifer go through the reasons and answer your questions, actually, and then we'll get back to.
And I just want to tell you that I'm here for item number 2, and I have had nothing to do with this. So unless it's context from our previous work, I have nothing to offer. You're experts over there.
So, one, I have a presentation if you'd like me to go through it.
Yeah.
And then I can go back and answer any questions, for instance, the one that Joy just asked. Okay.
Let's do it.
So, the purpose of this amendment is to package it with the other urban school code amendments that you guys heard on July 13th. So the idea would be to add this on. So it's standalone right now, but think of it as an add-on to that bigger package. That's why the title says continued. So where have we been? Where are we going? We've been to PPC. We came to you on July 13th. We're back today. We went to Land and Shore with this as an informational item in August, and we'll be going back after this public meeting in September with the full bundled package for Land and Shore to consider, and then make a recommendation to council for final decision, possibly as early as September 18th. So that's where we are, and that's where we're going, hopefully. So here's the actual code amendment. It literally is one line. All new public schools shall provide 50% of the required parking in structures. And yes, this falls in line with the research and the dialogue that was had associated with the Central Issaquah parking requirements that you also heard not too terribly long ago. So the findings, just as kind of a refresher, why are we doing urban school amendments? The intent of these amendments are to provide regulations for the development of public schools that better meet the needs of the school district. The proposed standards will allow schools to be sited on smaller properties and will allow more efficient use of the existing properties that they own. Smaller footprints would allow school siting on smaller properties, but a large amount of surface parking is really counter to what we were trying to do. So we wanted to remedy that by bringing this amendment forward to you and trying to add it to that bundled package. So we're trying to ensure that surface parking lots aren't kind of pushed to the maximum in use. So now we have questions. This is literally one of the smallest amendments I've ever done. So I'm here for your questions. We had conversation about the previous amendment, so I think we would try and focus just to this particular amendment and add it on if that's what you guys choose. Okay?
Just as clarification,
Yes?
it is 50%. Is this And add in, making it equal with 50% of the other amendments that we approved?
For parking in Central Issaquah, yes.
Just to verify that.
Yes. And I think that answers Joy's question as well. So does anybody have any questions? Well, before we dive into questions, you all got Connie Marsh's email. So I have paper copies of the attachment that she had in that email. If anybody would like them, just raise your hand and I'll bring you one.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you.
In the little bit of time that I said, give me your opinions, I think I realized that there are some opinions that might be interesting to hear. So what I'm going to do is open the public hearing at 6:40, and then we will go from there and let your discussions go on. So I don't have a sign-up sheet. I don't know if anybody's signed up, but does anybody? No. Is anybody, especially from the school district, willing to come up and explain their position and what they think of structured parking at 50% level?
Steve Crawford, Director of Capital Projects for the Issaquah School District. As we have been looking at compacting school footprints to allow for smaller parcels, we have looked at structured parking for some of those concept designs. We have, I guess, a couple of issues that when you're talking 50% structured parking requirements for an elementary school are about 93 parking spaces. We typically have a little bit more than that to help alleviate parking in the neighborhoods adjacent. But 93 parking spaces at 50% adds roughly $1 million to the cost of a school. That's roughly about 3% of the total cost of construction. That's not an insignificant amount. And if you're talking 95%, you're talking about 5 to 7% of the total cost of a school as an increase to accommodate the parking. Not an insignificant amount. As we look at compacting school footprints and reducing the area of land that we have to acquire, there gets to be a point where you're trading off the cost of structured parking versus the cost of not buying additional land to accommodate surface parking. So if you have an average of about 330 square feet per parking space and you take half of the 93 required, so you're looking at 46 spaces, it's about 15,180 square feet. That's 0.348 acres. If you're looking at $1 million an acre for the cost of land, you're looking at reducing the cost of land by roughly about $348,000, but you're increasing the cost of the construction by an additional $600,000. That's the difference in the cost of the structured parking versus the cost of the savings of land. So it is an increase, unless you're talking close to $3 million an acre for the cost of land. That's what it takes to kind of balance out the cost of structured parking. A surface parking space costs about $4,000. A structured parking space costs about $20,000 per space. If you go to sinking the parking below grade, then that cost goes up about another 10%. So the cost of structured parking is not insignificant. There is some balance when you're looking at buying new land. There are no large parcels. I mean, for the Hilltop site, we looked at condensing the elementary footprint down to a little over 5 acres. That's pretty condensed. The majority of the parking's in a structured situation. The reduced land area means that you're, in most cases, well, let's back up. The reduced land area means you're going to need less land for a school site. There aren't any 5-acre parcels around here that are basically level that have for sale signs on them. So you're going to be looking at consolidating parcels to form a school site in most all instances. And in most all instances, you're going to end up needing to take either homes or business properties. So smaller land areas are advantageous from a number of different reasons. And cost, being able to locate schools closer to the communities where the students are coming from so that there's a local service, a higher probability that students can walk to school, and provide neighborhood recreational facilities. I think the other thing that I wanted to mention is that in the rationale for the 50%, it talks about the IMC standards require that new public schools shall have a portion of the required parking and structured parking, the rationale being that the use of land for public schools must be done as efficiently as possible to ensure that public lands are used wisely. Part of what we had requested initially was the 90% impervious area. And I don't know that everybody really understands that when you put an underdrain under a playfield so that you can use it more often through the winter months, that's an impervious surface. So a sand playfield is an impervious surface. A turf football field, it's an impervious surface. A grass baseball field, it's impervious surface. So if you're looking at a 5-acre elementary site and a minimal amount of playfield space for an elementary at about 1 acre to 1.25 acres, you're looking at 15 to 25% of that land area, which is providing community recreational facilities, is considered impervious. And so it seemed reasonable to have a 90% level because in essence you're basically already way beyond that. If you look at a middle school or a high school with the size of a football field, the soccer, lacrosse field, softball field or baseball field, you're looking at close to 30 to 33% of a site that's devoted to recreational use, that's open space, that's impervious area. So even if you devote another 10% to the allowance, you're still talking at 30 to 40% of the area that most people would consider to be open space and would visualize it as pervious space, pervious surfaces. So when you combine those two things, it gets to be a pretty restrictive. When you increase the area of pervious surface that's required, means you have to buy more land. In the past, we've been working on existing school sites. Issaquah High, Issaquah Middle, and Clark were all existing school sites, and we've relied on the city to grant variances. Those facilities were existing non-conforming uses, so they exceeded the most restrictive adjacent zoning heights, most restrictive adjacent zoning impervious areas, so it was not without reason that a variance could be continued. When you're looking to buy new property, you really need to know what amount of land you're going to have to allow as open pervious space, not counting your play fields, not counting your building and parking, etc., because it's not really very prudent to assume that you're going to get a variance. It would be rather embarrassing to buy a piece of property assuming you're going to get a variance on an impervious area and then find that it's not granted and now you really can't fit everything. So as we're buying new properties, it becomes more critical to know in advance And, you know, we would like to minimize the amount of land that we have to acquire for each of the 4 schools that are planned, the 2 new elementaries, a middle school and a high school. But even a 50% requirement for structured parking does add to the cost of school construction. We are looking at bond funds that were voted in 2016. So we've seen the cost of construction already escalate. Sites that were identified as likely candidates for school sites are tied up in landmark decisions and decisions about appropriate use or not. So 50% increases the costs, not an insignificant amount. There is some trade-off to reduce land area. 95%, that's really a huge increase, and I think far beyond what's required of any other type of development in the city.
So I have a question before you go down. So putting in structured parking, you're saying there's 96 parking stalls that you would be putting in?
For an elementary school, there's 93 that are required.
Something like that. And half of that, so you'd have 2 levels, so you're going to shrink that down. Doesn't that open up more space for you to recreate on or do your, important things that the school has to do?
Yeah, it's about 15,000 square feet. It's about 0.348 acres, a little over a third of an acre that would be saved by putting a 2-level, 50% of the parking in structured.
So isn't that a value to
That is a
you?
value, and that's about $348,000 if you're paying $1 million an acre for the property. But it adds $930,000 to the cost of construction. So there's still a $600,000 premium to do that.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else want to comment on the proposal?
My name's Connie Marsh, and I live in Issaquah. I sent you an email that shows historically the amount of impervious surface, blah, 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 that the district has used just as a basis for understanding a little bit more about what's going on. Remember that the district is not necessarily just buying or trying to get small parcels. It also has some large parcels that it wants to use. So if you say it can have a large amount of impervious surface, there's nothing saying that they cannot just use that impervious surface for more surface parking. And so it is difficult to create a code that allows for a small parcel to be used without the unintended consequences of just creating a vast sea of asphalt in a large parcel. And so how do you solve this sort of conundrum within the code? You could split it into sizes of parcels, sort of like they did with retail and parking, right? If the size of the parcel is going to be X, then the surface parking, becomes up to the school district. How much land do they want to try to preserve for play fields as to how much they want to put in their surface parking. But then if you have a large parcel, it could force them to do structured parking to try to preserve the excess land for things like trees and actual impervious surface pervious surface when they do have the luxury on a larger parcel of keeping the land more intact. If you read the code as presented, it doesn't address the difficulty that I'm discussing, and the way it was given to you, it sounds like the only conversation you can have is about the parking itself. And so I don't think that we know enough about the consequences of this code. We don't understand even what the process would be for the small parcel at the top of the hill, because both development agreements are coming to their close and they're going to become code, and that is going to potentially change the process for anything adjacent to those areas. which that parcel is. And so I think it's unwise to come to a conclusion at this point in time. I don't think anyone entirely understands the consequences because too many codes are swirling at the same time. The school district is trying to not spend money and trying to create sort of tighter suburban schools. My point of view is that the city is trying to create a more urban footprint for schools with all the appurtenances that you would find in an urban school. We don't know because we actually have no policy for urban schools. So you're trying to make this decision in a void of policy. And so to me, the whole thing is just awkward and so unlikely to have a good outcome. And I expect that if you pass this tonight and the council passes it, we'll be revisiting again next year because of the unintended consequences. I have not gone on as long as Steve. I could, but I'm going to let somebody else chat after me. Thanks.
Thanks, Connie. Would anybody else like to make any comments on the proposal? Just on the proposal for the parking space?
Hi, thank you. Sorry I'm late. My name's Susan, and Susan Hass, and I live at 19524 Southeast 24th Place in Sammamish, and I'm a volunteer at the Issaquah Food and Clothing Bank, not blank, and I'm a vendor for the Recology Cleanscape store. And my comment is, and I apologize if Jennifer read it, but I don't think she probably had it. Okay, you did. Okay. I applaud the Commission's headway toward efficiently built, new, and redeveloped public schools. New standards, including some required structured parking, would make smaller than usual parcels feasible for schools, thus facilitating school siting. Still, the Commission's intention appears to be to allow the district to build to those standards on any CFF parcel, even if it is green open space covered with tree canopy and/or large. For this reason, I suggest that the Commission please revise the code amendment to state that the new standards apply to smaller than usual parcels and that school development is subject to the city's site planning, public process, regulations, and other policies for retaining trees and open space, etc. Such a revision would clarify the Commission's definition of the characteristics and location of urban schools. That one small change would make a difference. Thank you for your consideration. And also thank you for your patience. I'm quite new to learning about all these various policies and how they fit together and processes. And Trish Heinen explained a lot to me today that there are other down the road levels that would talk about trees and things like that. One example I was thinking of is Providence Heights. Could Providence Heights be subject to these standards for the CFF if it were rezoned CFF? And she said, well, there are other regulations down the road, but I just really strongly believe that if you clarify this up front, it would really help everybody understand, like the citizens and the school district and the city council. Thank you so much.
Steve? You're the only one that signed up.
Hi, Steve Pereira, Old Town Issaquah, about 10 years. So one of the things I think of is that before this current term of PPC started, I think it was Council President Goodman came and talked to you all and said that we really value your input. And I think that's kind of the basis for considering. Obviously, I have my opinion of where you should go with this, but her point and my point, I think, is you don't always have to take just the facts that are presented before you and vote on them, you can give valid opinion that might be broader or different than just the specific scope that's presented to you. And so to me, this scope of what should structured parking be isn't the right scope or perspective. As Connie said, there's so much more that needs to go into this. I think the whole issue of what is a urban school needs to be considered as policy beyond just the structured parking piece. So please take the time to consider that in your deliberations and provide that input if that's what you feel is best. On the structured parking piece, it seems to me the 50% that was advised for the other pieces like commercial and business and all that, it's based on dichotomy of how do we get people to come to Issaquah. With the case of schools, though, we don't have to get people to come to schools. They come to schools, and in fact, people come to Issaquah because we have high-quality schools. So we don't have to incentivize them by having a lower parking percentage required. So based on that, I would see, indeed, a 100% requirement seems to be an appropriate level for me for what should the structured requirement parking be for schools. Again, anything we can do to shrink the footprint of schools, because when we look at the city documents and it talks about things like tree canopy and our natural environment, those are the things that we're risking destroying, not just by cutting them down, but cutting them down on places that aren't designed to have that structure, to have that zoning in place. So take the time now to say, let's take a pause. It's okay to take a pause and have a higher requirement, and let's look at that structured parking in that wider perspective so we don't have to keep revisiting it piece by piece. Thanks.
Thank you.
My name is Mary Lynch, and I just want to build on what Connie and Steve said and also kind of support some of the stuff that Steve also said, Crawford said, is that I think we need better definition on what this is actually coming from as far as area of the city. You know, it's right now covering all the parcels and all the classifications. And I really think that we need to have policy for urban schools before we can begin to define this better. Because the other thing, as Steve mentioned, underground parking. Well, I don't really think underground parking is very feasible in most of the CI, the Essential Area Plan of Issaquah. Because if you go over to the library, you'll notice that that is a flood zone, and it has flooded before. So some of these is not even feasible to consider underground parking in a lot of these places. The other thing, since we haven't talked about urban schools, a lot of the urban schools, when you're really looking at it and you're going up with parking, what's on top of them? They're soccer fields. So that's how you can combine some of the pervious surfaces together. So, and maybe cut the cost some too. So there's a lot of options that can do it, but until we have some clear sitting down from the school district, the city, and the public talking about what we want the future of Issaquah and our schools to be, and hopefully getting that other arm in there, the developers who maybe, and the people that own the land, talking together and defining what the policies is, what we want to look like, and what the needs are. I really think this is trying to, I mean, it's going the right direction because you're trying to reduce the amount of space used, but I think it's too soon. And we tried to do this with the Central Area Plan, and what are we doing again? We're back redoing the codes. So let's do this in the right phase. Let's make sure we have the policy. Let's make sure we have all the players together that are sitting down and talking before we make the decision, just because we're doing something else right now. Thank you.
Does anybody else want to make a comment? Does anybody else, can't talk anybody else into making a comment? Okay, with that, I will close the public hearing at 7:05 and open it up to,
School district guy started to stand up. I don't know if he had something more to say.
Steve Crawford again. Just quick comment. We could look at putting the whole football field, the lacrosse, soccer track on top of parking. That's still going to be 100% impervious area, the whole thing. Solves nothing.
so with that, I will close the public hearing at 7:05. And I appreciate all your comments. I mean, they're all valid, they're all coming from concerned citizens, so that's positive, because those are the people who have been looking through all this and judging what the value is. Jennifer, would you like to say anything else or contribute? Maybe I can start it. What are the ramifications with waiting to make a final decision on this?
I can talk to it because I think we discussed it at the July 13th hearing too. I don't know, Keith, did you want to jump in?
No, go ahead.
Okay, you were grabbing the microphone size.
I am.
So the school district has bond money that they need to spend. In order for them to spend that money to say to buy new land, they need some level of understanding on what the requirements are going to be so that they can cite and find land that they can meet the requirements for. So this is all kind of time crunched based on when that bond money needs to be expended and how quickly they need to find land. And if I remember correctly, the bond passed in 2016, so almost a year and a half ago, maybe a little more. So time is feeling like it's running out. So
Is time based on years or is time based on months? Because there could be actually additional comments or.
So they're gonna, so let me jump in. So they're moving forward buying property now.
Oh, okay.
And, you know, if we don't pass code amendments, they will bring their land use applications in and we will process it against the regulations that are in place now. So what we're trying to do is work with the school district to put more appropriate provisions in place, including, and I think what we realized after we'd come through PPC the first time with those code amendments was that we had not addressed parking, and that by shrinking, by allowing the buildings to get taller and the setbacks to be reduced, I think to Connie's point, you are basically creating more space on the property for something. And the worst outcome would be surface parking lot, right? So we said, okay, let's require, as was happening with residential, commercial, and retail, let's propose requiring a portion of that parking to be in structure. So that's kind of how we landed here tonight, was we're catching up a piece that I think we admittedly didn't think of originally. Otherwise, it would have been part of that original package that we brought forward to you guys for consideration last month.
Keith and Jennifer, can you speak to, when we spoke about this, the first part of the package in July, we had talked about creating an urban school policy. Where are we at on staff kind of, is that in process? Well, I realize that isn't in front of us today. Do we have any update on that, you guys receiving those comments and working on that? Is, again, one of many work items you have, or do we have any update on that?
So the recommendation, as it's being processed through the public process right now, the agenda bill for the bulk of the amendments that we processed, or that we brought to you in July 13th, is making its way to council right now. In that is the recommendation that you guys made for us to look at urban school policy within the next year, is what I actually think the timeline was that was in the recommendation. So that's in there, that's for council's consideration, but that is actually an existing objective in your recommendations, or in your recommendations from July 13th.
So some of the comments have talked about, don't rush this idea. There's no problem in waiting. We should consider urban schools before moving forward with this. One question I have is, if we put in a 50% and make that decision before the urban schools conversation has happened, we still have the option then, when the urban schools conversation happens, to change that number, right?
And are you saying we as in the
city?
council, the city?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, because the idea that's running through my mind is, okay, if we stall and wait for that urban schools conversation to happen up to a year from now, and the school district makes a purchase of land with the assumption that they can put all surface parking on it, that changes things. So
So I've already stated my position here, and you all know it. So I want to present an argument, and the intention of the argument is to invoke discussion. And based on what we've heard from the school district so far, if we look at the future cost of money, we were kind of quoted here, $4,000 per space versus $20,000 per space. Land is at a super premium within Issaquah. So, and we're talking about possibly using eminent domain, where if we invoke eminent domain, the real estate costs will actually go up higher, because now you also have to associate legal costs tied to that parcel as well. If we use a rule of thumb of 95% structured parking, so anywhere from 5 to 20 stalls would be allowed for maybe in the front of the school for visitors, it is a more efficient and effective use of a scarce resource. So both money and in terms of land itself. So, and I also am not pushing back on the schools in terms of trying to be difficult. I want top-line schools, but I also realize that we are a growing community, and so there will be ever more pressure on our schools, and if we acquire smaller parcels today, and our student population keeps growing, where are we going to put those cars for the teachers, the faculty, the students? And so my concern is that we're not future-proofing this discussion by saying only 50% structured parking. And then in addition to that, I feel that providing covered parking for bicycles as well will help mobilize people because of inclement weather. And if we start looking at things like e-bikes, and I think e-bikes is a very viable future solution that's going to be coming to Issaquah. It's extraordinarily popular in Israel. And just because the United States today isn't a place where e-bikes are a fad, it will be coming to our areas as the cost of bikes go down. So I want to be very careful in moving forward with this proposition, and I think 95% is absolutely acceptable. We could also put in a recommendation to City Council that they consider moving forward with an urban school policy as they consider the structured parking requirements, and let them actually decide what to do as far as making a decision.
So let me further this conversation of percentages and their importance between 50% and 95% and all of that. So the cost of increasing that, we're talking here as the cost being to the school district, but really we need to think about that since the schools are paid for via bonds, the cost comes back to the homeowners and the taxpayers. And so when we're talking about the difference between 50%, zero structured, 50% structured, and 95% structured, the additional cost all goes to the taxpayer. So I think we need to kind of consider that and whether or not passing an additional $3 million onto the taxpayer is the right way to do things.
Do we have a choice? I mean, granted, I hear your argument. I don't want to pay any more than I absolutely have to. But when it comes to making the right decisions, then, and we know that land is going to be an extraordinarily scarce resource, how do we move forward with that? How do we actually increase capacity? If we have 10 acres of land available for a school, how do we maximize that for the future of the city? I mean, look how fast we're growing now. Think of what, I'm trying to look 20 years and 30 years out. That structured parking of 95% we're putting in as a requirement possibly today may not be 95% in 20 years. It may turn into 50% because they'll need additional parking space. How do we fix that?
So why would we ask of the school district and taxpayers to hit a 95% rate when we're not asking that of developers of retail or housing, where they're going to actually make money off of this?
Because we could either pay it up today or we can pay it up in the future. If we pay it up in the future, it's going to be a lot more expensive and a lot more difficult.
So let me take a step back. What is ultimately our goal in looking at structured parking for school sites? Is it because we believe that having surface parking lots in front of or behind a school district is bad visually and reduces pedestrians' ability to get to the school and all of those things? Or are we doing it for preservation of open space? Because if we're talking about the latter, then preservation of open space may happen in other ways, including asking developers to increase their rate and other things.
I'm looking at it from an optimization of space. So I'm not, and I understand the environmental aspect is important, but we need to look at it in terms of a tool. How do we make and create the most optimized tool to educate our student body, right? So by creating a 95% structured parking, and that could take on a lot of different forms. We could put schools on top of parking. We could do, if we push forward for the requirements, let developers come back with a solution. We don't know what that solution would look like. We don't know that it's a $20,000 per space parking. I think we need more information, but if we start off at 50% as what we have for office space, that might be adequate for office space because then they're restricted to the size, they can't grow, so they move on to a different building. Our schools are stuck, right? So we can't just buy new property or just create eminent domain and acquire property that way because it's not necessarily right to do that. And it may not be cost effective for us to do that. So if we build it, let's build it right. Putting 95% structured parking in today may save us money in the future. And if we look at the future cost of money, what it would cost us to build a 95% structured parking today may be a lot cheaper than it would be in 20 years from now. And so we might actually be money ahead by making that requirement today. That's how I'm looking at it.
Well, I have tons more thoughts, but let's open it up and see what's coming out.
And maybe I'll just add my thoughts. I mean, maybe at the risk of being simple. I mean, at this point in time, I appreciate the thought of being able to have an additional discussion about this in the future when we talk about the school policy. And also the need for some certainty right now. And then I have a hard time, based on that and knowing we're going to have a future conversation about school policy, I have a hard time, I guess, right now coming up with a number that's different than what we're already asking of other land uses. And so, I mean, I'm stuck on the 50% just because, I mean, if a few months down the road or 8 months down the road, whatever, we want to have a more detailed discussion about it and change it to 75 or reduce it to 25 or whatever, that's one thing. But, I mean, right now we're just picking numbers out of a hat, I think, you know. And so I say we put 50% in. There's some certainty for purchases and use of bond money. It's consistent with existing land uses, and then we can have a more informed discussion later. That's where I am on it.
Jennifer, is there a reason that the code specifies public schools rather than including charter schools, private schools? All schools basically would have to adhere to this code. Why is it that we specifically say public?
So let's focus on the fact that public schools go into the CFF zone. That's why.
Okay.
Because private schools wouldn't be rezoned CFF.
Private schools would be, sorry.
Would be-
Private
would be
schools
auto-
under commercial?
They would be whatever the underlying zoning is where they were allowed. And I can try and figure all of the different sub-areas that we have and where they're all allowed, but I don't know that I could do it right off the top of my head. Okay.
Do we have the option of being able to recommend an amount of structured parking for all schools, not just for this particular zoning that we're looking at? as in the next year, you guys are going through our urban schools, that applies to not just our public schools?
So the way this code amendment is set up is the pieces that we're amending are under the CFF zoning description in the land use code. So if we were to do amendments like that, they would go into a completely different section of the code, just in terms of the logistics.
That I understand. What I'm wondering is if that's even possible. If you guys are like, we're not willing to touch other places in the code right now, or if that is open. That's what my question is. I do understand that.
It probably, I would think that it would be open for discussion at a later time when we're putting the whole program together, but I don't think it.
So private schools, Joy, is, that's not, what we did earlier was office and retail specifically. So if the commission is interested in adding that, it would be a specific add to Central Issaquah to add to the code revisions that we just processed on residential office and retail. So if that is indeed something this commission wants to do, I think that can be an ask. It's, as Jennifer said, it's separate from what we're doing now, but it could be an add-on, and we have to figure out how quickly we have staff resources to turn that around. I just don't know right now, but it would be, you guys can make that as a kind of a follow-up recommendation if you as a commission felt like that was something that we just, missed. We're not infallible. We miss things.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I for one, am disappointed with how Mr. Crawford represented the school district's position as both questioning if we understand what an impervious surface is, and then having a kind of what I consider to be a limited scope as to how we use our space. I think having structured parking below playfields and being able to combine different impervious surfaces is something that's happened across our country very successfully. And having, while it does give an increased cost, stopping this kind of spread of an asphalt jungle and trying to really create a really true small-scale footprint is essential. And I wish that we were hearing a little different perspective from the school district that was encouraging those kinds of maybe out-of-the-box thinking, that rather than just saying, we would like to have as much open, sprawling parking as possible. So I, for one, am for a higher amount than 50%. I think that our government, our schools should be leading a standard. When we had our discussions about retail, we were talking about trying to encourage people into the community, and I would like to see our standards for the schools be something that has a much higher standard. So I do see a difference in putting a different standard. If we think that Ron's proposal of 95% is a little egregious for some, I would be fine to find a middle ground. Maybe that is 80%, and that makes people feel better about it. But I, for one, would like to vote tonight about increasing the amount beyond the 50%, and agree that it shouldn't be something that's tabled for a future discussion, because I do think it's something that we should have in place now for the school district to have to abide by.
So let me see if I can ask another question. Are there any urban school policies or structured parking requirements in any other local cities that we know about? Anything that we can use as guidelines? He says no.
So now I have to talk.
Okay.
So the research that was done as part of the structured parking amendment, other than Federal Way, which just enacted a requirement for structured parking for multifamily projects, I think over 100 units, was 25%. That's it. Everybody else in the region is, Bellevue wrote a rather detailed email. Mike Brennan, who serves on Development Commission, is Director of Development Services in Bellevue, and we contacted him regarding the Spring District, which is, again, very forward-thinking, urban, density, conversion, transit, light rail, all the good stuff. And he said there is no structured parking requirement. They specifically decided against that. They have taken the position that if land develops, it is at a cost, and the requirements that are associated with developing in it will lead projects to have to build structured parking. So they decided to set the structure in such a way that they think it will result in structured parking. So we are definitely leading by a far margin.
Wow, that was hard to say. So, and one comment for Joy's suggestion, just for thought, is, so this is a minimum requirement. So the 50% is what we would say is minimally expected out of a new school development. I mean, your comments about the school district should be a leader and should push that to some higher number. I guess the question for you is the city going to mandate that? Or is that something that should come out of maybe that follow-up conversation that's more policy related about urban schools and addressing that form and function a little bit differently than through a required standard? And I'm just throwing that out as a thought, something for you to think about, not suggesting anything other than what you said earlier.
I wish that the opinions of the school district were presented in a way where they were more open, but the way that they've been presented to us in this meeting and in a previous meeting show me that minimums are there for a reason, because otherwise, without that with giving them so much leeway, they're going to take the smallest amount possible because they believe that that's what's in their better interest, and I would like to encourage them to think a little bit better, and that's why I would like to increase the minimum from that 50%. While I don't need it to be 95%, I would be a proponent for increasing that amount.
So I agree with a lot of the things that have been said, also by Joy, as far as the creative use. I think that the idea of the play fields over the parking lot, yes, that would add cost, but that's also consolidating impervious surface. It's more impervious surface, but it's impervious surface in layers on top of itself. So it does free up more land to be pervious surface. I think that the 50% in the last meeting when we were talking about that, it was talked about as being this very aspirational number because there aren't a lot of examples of other policies where any requirement is required at all. And so I think that the 50% and to standardize it with the other businesses, that would be what I would be in favor of, especially because even that 50% is kind of breaking new ground and hasn't really been tried before, and that's also what we're proposing for these other businesses. And I do think it's important for public schools in particular. Private schools, they're various in size of public schools too, but some public schools that will be in the future will be very large and will have very large parking lots, potentially, could be very sprawling, large parking lots if there's not a requirement. So I think that it's important to have some requirement, and I think that 50% is a reasonable amount.
Carl?
I agree. It's a very difficult balancing act for the schools. And from a taxpayer perspective, I want to get the most we can with our money. And I'm worried that if we delay this much longer for another year or something, the school district's going to spend, as you said, they'll try to do it as cheap as they can. On the other hand, from the school district's perspective, 95% potentially triple, maybe quadruple the cost of 50% parking. I'm sort of saying, at least for the present time, particularly since we have a money crisis or a time factor for money that's available for a particular project, or right now for that bond issue, we've got to do something with it or lose it. We should go with the 50%. And then after the urban policy process goes through, we can look at, well, maybe we need to change from 50%. We still have that option, but at least we'll have something set in primarily so the school district can do their job and make plans.
I agree. I think that the school districts have a lot of work and problems trying to actually fit the schools on a particular piece of property. And I think that having the semi-requirement of at least 50%, and that, as he said, a minimum of 50%, will get us through the next round of meetings so that we can put people together to address the issue and see where we're going. And I don't know how much power the city has in actually designing the schools, because the city doesn't know what the schools need. Only the school district with their background and their information knows exactly what the schools need and how to put it together. And if we sit down with this committee or whatever you want to call it, and you do come up with creative solutions, I think that's where we need to go, more than mandating that 95% or 100% of parking be in covered parking. My grandkids go to school in Hong Kong, and they are in a big building with parking underneath, and their school is on top of there is no land over there either to expand. And so that's an option that I think we need to look at, and I think everything should be on the table. And it's hard once you're working for a school district or any organization, and you work hard, and this is what you come up with, and you just assume that that's the way it's going to be, and you don't think out of the box. And I think we need to really think out of the box for the future for our schools, not just demanding 95 or 100%. I think there's a lot to learn and do, but the school district needs to go forward. I don't think they might be looking at parcels of land, but I don't think they're looking at 4 specific things. And I think we can always come back in a few months and have some negotiating and see exactly if we can think out of the box and come up with better ideas. So I agree with at this point in time, the minimum of 50% would be a starting point of where we should go. So any other comments? You've all made some reasonable, good explanation of where you are. I do need, if we go forward, I do need someone to make a motion one way or the other to continue on with this. So Troy, you look like you're ready.
Yeah, I would move that we pass the amendment as proposed by staff.
Second.
Let's make a second motion.
You can make an amendment to the motion. The motion's on the table right now, 50%.
So I'd like to make an amendment to the motion that we include 100% covered parking for bicycles unless there is already capacity, unless there's already sufficient covered parking for bicycles. And I would like to make an amendment to the motion that we raise it to at least 60%.
The maker of the motion has to agree to the amendment. Does the maker of the motion agree to the amendment?
I do not.
The motion failed. The amendment does not, from what I understand, right? Okay, so there's a motion on the table of accepting the 50% structured parking as proposed by staff. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed?
Nay.
Aye.
So we have 4 for and 3 against, so I would assume that the motion passes. With that, we will go into the second discussion on,
That was the easy one.
Uh-oh.
Just kidding.
They know he's not.
but I think we have to make it clear that there is going to be more discussion with the people that are in the know that continue this.
we will be back.
Okay.
You need to say that in the accent.
Missed opportunity.
So, good evening. I'm Lucy Sloman, Land Development Manager, DSD. Tonight, we are having a public hearing on the design manual, which is a new tool. As I mentioned in my email, we know that there are punctuation, grammar, wordsmithing issues, and that InDesign has created a somewhat funky document. So if, as you see things, feel free to email me. Also, feel free to ask questions as we go along this evening. So just for a little bit of history, July 11th, 2016, staff did the first required 3-year evaluation of Central Issaquah. We evaluated 14 projects. They all complied with the Central Issaquah standards, and they were considered not to have met the community's expectations. That led to the as part of the moratorium on September 6th, architectural fit and urban design were identified as 2 work plan items. Subsequently were combined into a single item, and the consultant Crandall Arambula was hired to prepare the manual. So what we're talking about tonight, and I'd like to invite, there are 3 members of the Development Commission that are here tonight. We've set up the table so that they can come and join in. We're thinking of this kind of like what we've been doing with the UVDC and PPC in anticipation of the ending of the development agreements. And so because this is going to be the tool that DC will use going forward, we thought, and since they've spent all this time, it seemed appropriate for there to be a dialogue. So I would invite you up to the table. And I know these men are famous, but they should probably introduce themselves. Infamous.
Infamous.
You have to choose which hat you wear.
Is this on? Okay, my name's Richard, so I'm the chair of the Development Commission.
I'm Randy Harrison. I'm on the Development Commission.
I'm Mel Morgan. I'm the vice chair of the Development Commission.
So as you can see up on the screen, we have held a number of meetings, 6 with the Development Commission and 2 with the council as work sessions. In those meetings, Crandall Arambula and sometimes city staff have assessed some of the challenges that Central Issaquah has faced in implementing the Central Issaquah standards, identified the components that would be incorporated into the design manual, and spent several meetings reviewing the first draft. So I think the thing we're going to sort of start with the conclusion, which is the checklist that Crandall Arambula developed. It highlights that the design manual is divided into 2 primary components, architecture and urban design, and that the purpose is really to create a tool that both staff and the Development Commission can use to track the reviews and figure out whether a proposal is in compliance. And we have already used this as sort of a trial run with a project that was approved under Central Issaquah as sort of a test case. That was a good opportunity for us to see how this might work. Now what I'd like to do is kind of run through sort of at a high level the components and look at some of the important details. The first is that Crandall Arambula, which I sometimes call CA just because it's easier to say, divided Central Issaquah into 2 main districts. There was the urban core, which is the area that's sort of missing from here, And then the everything else surrounding the urban core was a second district called Traditional Issaquah. Just note that they've called out certain neighborhoods, Eastlake, Darst, and Gilman. Those aren't all the neighborhoods that are in that surrounding area. I'm not quite sure why they chose those, but I cheated and used their slides. One of the policy questions, which I didn't include in the memo, but which might be a good place to talk about with the two commissions, is the way the manual is currently structured has a fairly bright edge between the urban core and this traditional Issaquah area. The commission spent a lot of time talking about that. Should those edges be blurrier? CA looked at, they watched the videotapes of the commission sessions. Staff talked about it. Both staff and Crandall Arambula, staff kind of concurred with Crandall Arambula's position that we should keep a brighter edge. But that is one thing that may be worth talking about either now or later, about whether that should continue to be a brighter edge or should be a blurrier line between the two districts. If you want.
I guess I feel a little compelled to set the stage a little differently. As a member of the Development Commission, one of the things we continued to struggle with was having developers come, make presentations to us, and our response being, well, we're not sure we like it, but it's consistent with the rules and regulations, and so we need something more. We needed something more to be able to help us be more definitive in what our expectations were. And so that generated the whole notion of the design manual. And the consequence of that is that because we struggled so much, often having to say, well, it meets the standard, so we can't really complain about it or change it or challenge it very much. Just not liking something doesn't usually get you very far. We wanted to be real specific. So you're always trying to balance that notion of prescriptive versus aspirational, as CA always said. You know, I mean, the bottom line is, in the pure sense, we'd like it to be black and white, but the reality is there's nothing black and white. You know, so being able to try to be as definitive as possible, but not eliminate options or you know, when you get right on a borderline, is it absolutely imperative that if it's in one zone, it has to be this, and if it's not, we think there's some grounds for dialogue and discussion, but our general default is to be as prescriptive as we possibly can so that we can eliminate confusion in the dialogue. That's the whole point of the design manual.
Lucy?
So is your recommendation then to keep Lucy's idea of a bright edge at the discretion of the Development Commission?
I think in general, we would like as bright an edge as possible, acknowledging that there are times when that just doesn't make sense. That we don't want to miss opportunities because of an arbitrary line that we decided that was a good thing to do, right? So it really, like I said, I think our preference would be to make it as black and white as possible, but there's also got to be acknowledgement that it's never always black and white. That's what always causes the dialogue, that's the tough part.
So instead of one line around, you're going to have two. So there's this area between the two designations where it could be either one.
Well, I think we'd like to have one line.
Well, I mean, that's kind of an easy way of saying it.
Also recognize that that may not always work.
And I would add at this point that one of the benefits that I think the commission sees with this approach is that it's not just the city that benefits from this, it's the potential applicants. Because we believe the effect of this will to give someone who wants to come into Issaquah and do something a much clearer set of, well, I can't do that there, I can't do this kind of architecture here, but I may be able to do it over there. The point is that we believe it will have a significant benefit in helping applicants before they even come before the city staff with their initial paperwork, to understand what the city wants and where we want it.
I'll throw in one other thing too. I think one of the concerns about the Bright Line is the only design that's allowed within the urban core is the Northwest traditional. So there's only one style in a fairly large area of Issaquah where a lot of development should take place, where there's only a single style that could happen. I think the commissioners felt more inclined to allow other styles to seep into the urban core as opposed to letting Northwest Contemporary seep out into traditional Issaquah. That would be where I think the Bright Line could be a problem. We don't allow some seepage, I guess we call it.
So that really would be a bright line at the discretion of the Development Commission, a case-by-case basis.
Well, right now, the way it's written, within the urban core, you can only do the traditional, Northwest traditional style and nothing else.
So it's not at the discretion of DC, it's at the, it would be in code. So right now, this is going forward ultimately to the council to then get codified, and it would be then in code. So DC would have clear direction on what architecture could go where. It's not, this was bantered back and forth, and I don't think all of the commissioners landed in the same spot on whether that should be a bright line or whether it should have some flexibility. And I think part of, at least the conversation at DC was, it's kind of like a new pair of trousers. We're going to try it on and see how it fits. And as things come through, we're going to have some realizations that, maybe after we see the second or third building that looks the same, we might want to say, hey, some flexibility in that line might make a lot of sense at that point. I don't know. I think we all kind of agreed that let's take this thing for a test run and see how it plays. So
I guess, could we see what that would look like written, what you're asking?
what's being proposed right now is bright line.
Okay, hard bright line.
Hard bright line, no flexibility.
So what I was hearing from DC is maybe it might make sense to look at some of the, how many styles were there proposed?
There's 1 in the urban core and 6 in traditional Issaquah.
Yeah, so maybe some of those 6 we consider okay for the urban core, such as the Northwest Revival style that is a little bit taller, something like that. And that might keep that bright line, but still present more options so that we're not getting the same project in the urban core over and over and over again. Maybe.
Well, and I think I want to just tag on to what, well, a couple of things. One, I would say, Richard reminded me of something that I had meant to say earlier, which was the code was, Central Issaquah standards were intentionally written, focused on urban design and not architecture. And we tried that for a number of years, and we're deciding that didn't, those are the trousers, they didn't fit right. We're going to take them to the tailor. And I like bell bottoms. And in looking at this, I think that the representative members of DC who are here tonight have characterized it quite accurately. There was a lot of discussion. Should it be a bright line? Should those styles be allowed everywhere? Should they be allowed in a ring? There were a number of different suggestions. We took that back to CA and asked for their recommendation. Their recommendation was to keep a bright line. That does not mean that we cannot alter it, but I think that's why there has not been, it didn't come forward in a different format, because there was not a clear consensus coming from DC. And there were a couple of different options that were possible, and there was, as I said, not clear direction.
Can I ask a question, or I'm going to ask a question? Is this related to commercial, retail, multifamily development, but not single-family development, I would assume?
It would be any development that occurred. It is unlikely, though not prohibited that single-family would be built.
Because this is only
We've had
applying
one
to-
proposal in the 4 years for a single-family.
This is only
house.
applying to something that goes to a level 3 review, right?
No, it applies to everything.
Okay.
And it's just that, given the allowed heights and densities and uses, it's unlikely that people would tend to redevelop with single-family.
So this is just in central Issaquah, and so think about what's down here now. You would basically have to buy out an existing shopping center to build a plat. Now, that's not unheard of, but the land values probably aren't going to be very appealing to many people to do that. So I think our
I was
expectation.
trying to look at the map and consider whether or not the area behind like Gilman Village, the housing there is included in that.
Right?
Yes.
I mean, this area, the sort of Gilman neighborhood, does have some single-family houses. I believe the one single-family house that we've received was in that area. And, you know, I think the thing about it is that arts and crafts, craftsmen are, you know, easily used for single-family homes. They may have even, you know, they were sort of the genesis of that style. So I think that the tools, while intended for the other uses that you identified, are not problematic for a single-family house.
I have a question about the line for the Western Gateway. When we had gone over the proposed things for Old Town, the city had recommended that we push that boundary, and I believe that the recommendation of this commission was to keep it at that crossroads of Gilman and Front Street. And I'm curious where that line is lying, if that was passed, and I'm thinking of it specifically in regards to the former Staples building, in regard to what is able to be built here. Does that line put us right at that juxtaposition of Gilman and Front Street, or is that past the Staples?
So Staples is not in this. This is, so it's kind of the beauty and the challenge of these 6 moratorium items being dealt with. There are different pieces being addressed. This piece is working with the boundary just as it is, without changing any of the boundaries.
And is that boundary at Gilman and Front Street, or is it past the Old Town boundary?
Let me do this.
It's a Gilman in front. So the Staples property is currently in Old Town.
Yeah.
And, you know, as we talked about, so that issue specifically is being handled both with the Old Town Plan update as well as the neighborhood vision conversations. And that's the Route 66 neighborhood that might potentially get added to. I think where those balls haven't stopped bouncing yet, because the Old Town Plan update hasn't been approved and the district vision is happening last. But it seems like, at least at this point, that property is staying in Old Town.
Okay.
So on this map, this red line represents the boundary, and this would be the Staples property right here. So it would be right on the edge, but outside of Central Issaquah.
To me, that's a great example of where we talk about having this hard and fast line, a bright line versus a blurred line, as we talk about how we try to create a style of how when people are coming through Issaquah, we've talked about wanting to promote commerce in our city, and so that's why my question is, because I think that's a good example of a property that when we have either, if it's been expanded, we have one option of how a style of which it can be redeveloped versus if it falls into the other bucket. And so I think of that particular corridor as being a good example of how we really have an illustration of these 2 different styles kind of meeting head to head. And that's why I ask about where that line is falling right now. And I realize maybe that hasn't really been approved yet, but to me, that's a good example that I would think about, is kind of how that kind of juxtaposition of where those lines come together and what we want that to look like.
Really good point.
So that would be Old Town?
Yeah, currently it looks like that would be
Currently.
Old Town. It's right on the edge of the Issaquah style that they list there, but I
Yes.
think that in our packet is called traditional Issaquah, not the urban core. So it actually
Yes.
has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different.
6, with the new Northwest Revival.
There's a new one, yeah.
Ah, yes, 6.
So the Grange style and Western Falls Front were both, I think, added to the traditional Issaquah area to reflect what's happening in Old Town and what's happening kind of along the service area of kind of central Issaquah. So there is, I think, some compatibility there in some of the choices that are available. But that particular parcel, and right now if it does stay in Old Town, part of the Old Town update is to also update the architecture and urban design standards for that sub-area. So that would be a separate thing that would happen next year.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was curious too, in reading the packet, when we talk about a blurred line, it seemed whenever there was a creek, reservoir, there was this language about how it needs to have natural materials that are used to help kind of blur that line of our open space and green space. Would you argue that that is a way of blurring the line of how we're directing what materials can be used next to green space? And again, I look again at these kind of hard lines of the Issaquah style versus, when we have Pickering, I see we have some green necklace going up. And so to me, that's kind of a way of softening, is saying when you're within, I think it was 100 or 150 feet.
150.
That you have to use particular styling. So to me, that was kind of a way of blurring it. Am I reading that incorrectly, kind of, or?
No, I don't think you're reading it incorrectly. I think that the urban design elements transcend use and style. It will, that piece of the context will make, I think, more of a gesture towards the natural areas, which we want to spend some time talking about what is in and what is out. But I'm not sure that the style will, for instance, traditional Issaquah reads more traditionally, and Northwest Contemporary reads more contemporary, and I think that will continue even if you are using, say, more natural materials, for instance.
This is a question for the Development Commission. So I understand the idea of voting yes or no on a bright line, but what could be some of the options for implementing a blurred line in terms of the policy? And one thing that was put forward would be to allow a different style in the urban center, urban core. But to me, that just seems like a change. It's still there's still a bright line, and you're just allowing something more inside the bright line. So I'm just wondering how you would implement a blurred line, what possible options there would be for doing that.
So I did mention that, and just quickly to say that two of the options that were discussed was there a transitional ring, or were styles allowed, certain styles or all styles were allowed throughout the urban core?
Okay.
From our perspective, we would just get whatever staff would send to us, and if there's a bright line, and if it's not allowed, it's not allowed. If you have flexibility, I think the best is if somebody came to staff and said, we want to do this style within the urban core, it fits one of the other styles, we think it would look well in the urban core, and if staff has the flexibility to bring it to us and say, would you agree with that? And if we have that flexibility, I don't know how they actually write that into that ability to do that. It's like having our cake and eating it too, I
Yeah,
guess.
and I think what I would want folks to understand is we're not talking about Berlin with a wall that says that's that side and this, and there are no exceptions. If you try to cross it, you're going to get shot. My take on this is that we think the hard line basically sends the message that this is what we have agreed on with a lot of work, a lot of different people. This is what we have agreed on is the approach that is going to best suit the interests of the city long term. I personally believe that the reality is, when we get something from an applicant that goes to the staff, and the staff goes, yeah, that's a good idea, but do this and that, and then it comes to the Development Commission, even though it may transgress the hard line, if it's an acceptable style and staff agrees with it, and the applicant agrees to the adjustments that make it acceptable to bring forward to us, we should be able to at least consider it.
So with that, and normally, the way we do it is to open up to public comment before we all discuss this, and it seems like just this one little issue is going to take a while. And so what I'd like to do is find out if there's anybody, I'm going to open the public comment at 8 o'clock on this one particular issue, and would like to know if anybody would like to make any comments. Steve, come on up.
Hi, Steve Pereira. So two thoughts occurred to me. One was, as I look at this and this idea of the map, I guess two thoughts. One was this Issaquah style and the central or style. I would also like to see revision to the Issaquah style to have a down zone for height of the building to a set height. Even if you have a 5-story traditional style, it's still going to be too big for the surrounding areas. So I'd like that considered as food for thought. I would also like to see that those specifically applied to what talks about the bottom right corner where we talk about the old Route 10. I would like to see that specifically down zoned to have a less density with those traditional style areas in addition to the Old Town area. So those are kind of my first thoughts. My second thought was, as I heard you, Richard, you talked about, and I've gone to a lot of the Development Commission meetings, you've had stuff come forward and you only have the choice. The code says we have to allow it, we have to allow it. There's no ability to say, no, we don't like it for the color of the building and the material. So I applaud the ability to have more the ability to say, no, that just looks dumb or looks ugly. So I think those are pluses that move forward with that idea. Why I want the flexibility for the Development Commission to say no, not just because the code says so, but no because that's ugly or that's dumb, and you don't have that ability today. So I think that's a step in the right direction. Thank you.
I'm just pulling up a different map. Please continue.
Connie? Yeah, go.
Like that hasn't happened?
Microphone hold? Nice earring.
Thank you.
She told me to come up here and help her.
Yes, I did, but I didn't realize that it would take so
There.
long.
Sorry. I had a lot of things open.
Nice jacket.
No, just switch places, it would.
Okay, Connie Marsh again. So I think it's a step in the right direction. I listened to the Development Commission's conversation, and they're really trying to figure out how to make a consistent, flexible, and attractive composition that they have the power to change, which I think is impossible to get, right? So I understand it's impossible to begin with. One of my concerns is some of our buildings that I consider to be sort of some of the best Issaquah buildings, I've not been able to understand whether they would be allowed in the different zonings. And that would be like the library building, because it doesn't really fit the themes. And so I concocted a little grouping of those pictures and called it Northwest Industrial, but because it seems like a lot of our buildings sort of have an industrial edge. And so I would actually prefer to see another category added on to the core area that would provide another style that I think would work. Now, they talked sort of around it and never concluded that that's where they wanted to go because it seems very complex already. But I think it needs to be discussed. The other thing that was sort of put aside, saying it was taken care of by other code, is the view protection from the variety of buildings and the architecture that is provided. You have all kinds of different things you have to look at from up close, the materials that it is made from, but it never really takes you in a step back and says, how does this look in the context of everything around it? And I would like to see that more clarified from what I was provided. Thanks.
I'm not sure how that would work. Is anybody else? Good ideas. I just don't know how to put that together. Please come and.
Yeah, Susan Hast again. I just think it's really interesting, those tasks that you're trying to do, because on one hand, you're trying to encourage certain things. If Staples parking lot were redeveloped, you wouldn't want it to be the same exact thing, I'm guessing. You might want parking on the side and the back and, something different. So, and you're trying to encourage sustainability in the city and all sorts of innovations, bicycle parking, covered bicycle parking, like all these, and architectural, some sort of cohesion. And at the same time, like, I'm a visual artist, so I like freedom. I like to be able to do things that are weird, and I like seeing weird things out there that don't fit in, because it reminds me that they're human beings and it's not a movie set. It's not a constructed social engineering project. It's not Aspen. It's not, it's sort of like Issaquah. So at the same time, I just think it's a really interesting initiative that you have, where you're trying to encourage ecological and visual progress in Issaquah and land use progress, and at the same time allow for people to exercise their creativity and improvise on their own and encourage them to do that, just like you might with a kid, figure it out yourself sort of idea. And you at the same time, it's a government, it's a public entity, so it's impossible to have situations that look like, it depends on if somebody likes you at City Hall, Do I make a good impression? Are they going to do this because I know their brother or something like that? So I think that, the more you can provide resources, the better. The more you can maybe, I don't know, I've seen model ordinances in Minnesota where they talk about architectural things like Christopher Alexander's book, A Pattern Language, all about how do you make human scale places? How do you make places that are good to live in? Jane Jacobs, like these principles. And I've seen a lot of neat things happening in Issaquah like that. And so I guess I just really feel for you, because I can kind of tell where you want to go with this. And I just really wish you the best. Thanks.
Would anybody else like to make a comment?
David Kapler. Some flexibility is something I wish you would have. I guess also, in some cases, I wish you had veto power. Everybody talked about Atlas. Atlas is a joy compared to what people are telling me about Gateway. And it's just got a whole bunch of stories running next I-90 that are going to be rising from those concrete foundations that are there. And I wish we had a way of steering that differently. But it's a challenge, what you're doing, and keep up the work. Thank you.
Would anybody else like to make a comment? Would anybody else like to make a comment? Seeing nobody, I will close the public hearing at 8:10 and open it up to continued discussion.
So one point I would like to make is that, and you may remember this from your training, there are two kinds of due process that we are legally required to meet. One is procedural due process, that means giving notice, but the other is substantive due process. And substantive due process means that the rules have to be clear and predictable. And so discretion to just say no based on something other than what's in the code will lead us back to the Supreme Court, which as an urban planner, I don't like going into land use trainings and being reminded of. So I think understanding the wishes of the Development Commission and the Planning Policy Commission and crafting language that has criteria for the things that we want. If it's different than a bright line, we can certainly talk about. But we can't simply say, someone's made a good case, so we want, and I'm just taking it to an extreme, I'm not saying anyone's suggested this, but if someone came in and said, I want to do a bungalow in the urban core, can I do that? We would have to say no, because right now that's not the way the rules are written. And so we cannot be capricious. That's one of those tests that we're required to meet.
So I've got a question about this packet. In terms of the discussion that we have right now, I don't remember seeing in language this discussion. Is it in this packet, or is this something that's been just brought to our attention that we need to discuss?
When we were putting together the presentation, we realized that this might be another policy piece that was worth discussing this evening. So it was not in the packet, you're right.
So we should not make a decision tonight until we see that idea written in a policy form, or would that be an amendment to this document?
Well, I don't know that, I think what we're looking for is guidance from the commission. I have not gathered that there is a consensus at this time. That's what got us to this. So we're looking for guidance, and depending on what that guidance is, we can discuss how to move forward.
Okay.
I think you had mentioned in the document that this had been approved by council, but I was really secretly hoping there was going to be somebody here tonight to talk to us about that when going through this document.
It has not been.
It has not been?
We've had 2 work sessions with the council.
The council. So, well, no, so I'm sorry, with legal counsel is what I mean to say.
That kind of counsel.
So when I was going through this document, I really couldn't shake from every page thinking about Anderson v. Issaquah, and I think with good reason. I'm sure a lot of us were thinking about that. And so when looking at the urban core and seeing more limited choices, it made me concerned that we were going to be opening ourselves up to this kind of either this or no situation. And thinking about the particulars of the case, to me, it speaks to this blurred line issue of saying how much can we allow, giving developers some sort of leeway that still fits within the way that we view our city, since we've obviously had issues with that. And so I was hoping to have legal counsel here for kind of talking specifically to how this document opens us up, or how this protects us, or...
So this was sent to legal counsel. They reviewed it. They identified 2 issues. That was not one of them. The 2 issues they identified, one was clarity on how to know what an inappropriate color was, and clarity around the idea of compatibility. That's why you had the 21 extra pages at the end where certain terms were altered or additional graphics added to address that. Urban core was not one of the areas of concern from the city attorney.
So for those of you
The number of
who-
options in the urban core.
That was not a concern.
It's not, I don't think it's, so the issue, the liability issue that is being kind of alluded to is the city was sued a while back, and the code that the city was using was declared to be void for vagueness. That's a planning term. It's basically not providing enough clarity that an applicant can actually get through the process. And so what was basically decided was that that project that was being contended was considered not fitting with Issaquah's style, but nobody then defined what that was. And so the applicant, they won because the city didn't do a good enough job describing what that actually meant. Here, what we've tried to do was take code language that was things like, because the way this was originally written, was, we want to encourage steep roof pitches. Okay. What does that mean? Because what that means to me may not be the same as what it means to you. So we asked our consultant, we need to get some quantifiable numbers in there so that when the commission actually gets an application, they can say, okay, that roof is too flat. It doesn't meet the standards, and therefore we can say no. And so we've gone through it to the best of our ability to make it understandable for an applicant. Now, I think that having one style in the core doesn't cause a problem so long as an applicant can sleuth through that process and get to a permit at the end of the day. And so just because there's not more flexibility, I don't think puts the city at risk. And I think that's where the city attorney also agreed with that position.
Thank you.
Lucy, how does the concept, because in the past, on the Development Commission, we would have something and then we'd hear the administrative adjustment of standards. Does that create the flexibility that you're looking at, or potentially? That, we've got bright line rules, but then all of a sudden we have this administrative adjustment of standards, which changed, with stuff in regards to the wedding cake on a building. We could make it go higher because we did an administrative adjustment. So is that the out that the Development Commission could have? I don't know.
So right now, this is not, administrative adjustment of standards are not available for this. If there is we can discuss it. I think that Crandall or Rambula has heard a concern from the Development Commission that AASs were used too frequently. And so this is it.
Okay.
So, but again, that is our consultant's recommendation. That's why we're having this conversation with these 2 commissions.
So you can look at you have the requirements for the core, and everybody's saying it's one style, but that one style is so different. You can use different materials, you can use everything to make it more unique.
Right.
So I think that you have to make sure that is understood, that it's not every building has to look the same. It just has to flow a little bit better.
Well, what we were really looking for is to be able to establish a template.
Oh, absolutely.
And hoping that there was enough creativity in the architectural community that they could look at that and say, we can meet this template, but here's some interesting ways to do it. And then we have there are pictures that would say, if it looks like this, I think that's really a good idea. We'd really like to go with that. But if it looks like this, we really don't want to see that. And I think it gives the developer a bar to try to hit. that I think there's plenty of creativity in that if you choose there to be.
The developers need that. I mean, it makes their job a lot easier. They know what they can do, how they can do it, and know what the costs are going to be, and they don't have to spend 3 years going through the permitting process. I mean, it's a win-win for everybody, and it's a win-win for the city.
Well, frankly, it makes it easier for us because we don't have to see stuff that we just don't want to look at.
And I'm tired of yelling at Carl because he approved something that I didn't like.
And you know, that's, Madam Chair, I think that's what I was alluding to in my first comment. I believe that all of us on the commission, there are things that fuzz points, I guess you should call them, but that we believe that this will make it a more well-defined process for everybody involved, including the public. And I would just add, sitting in here and listening to your discussion with the school board, one of the things that I enjoy most about being on the Development Commission is the fact that, you know, this is public input is a critical component of what this city does and how we do it. And what we produce are living documents. So just as the case with the school board issue, you know, we could come back. What we're doing now is going, well, we need to adjust. We need to adjust this. We have the plan in place. We've been through it for 3 years, and now we know what didn't work as in the execution as we planned. So this is a living process, and that's it's enormously encouraging to me.
But there is a process. I mean, that's what I felt there was a problem with the central area plan. That was, this is the plan and we want this, but there was no way to get that. And I appreciate the work you've done on, I think you've covered just about every possible thing that you could cover.
Well, we don't think we have. But we think this is a good start, and I guess that's, I think, a point that needs to continue to be made is this isn't the end product.
That's exactly.
You know, we would hope, we think that we did a number of things with this. We set the bar, but more importantly, we opened up the opportunity for some public dialogue to be able to take a look at that and say, yeah, this works, this doesn't work. And we gave a real clear track for developers to be able to have a best shot at coming up with something good. We in no way think that it's done. You know, we think there'll be.
One thing I'd like you to require on all these buildings that the ones you have flat roofs on, gardens, trees, interface with nature on top of those buildings. I don't know why that it actually isn't in there. It just makes more sense. You go into Seattle and you see that in Seattle, but there are no requirements here in this stuff that you presented. Does anybody else want to continue the conversation? Is there anything else? Is there something in there that specifically you have a problem with?
Actually,
Go ahead. No, go ahead. You were first.
Oh, I've just got one very, very small thing on page 102 of 147, where we're talking about building edges and entries. One of the areas, it talks about inappropriate, any customer entries accessed directly from parking lots or alleys. I really appreciate the idea of public entries being at the street area, but one of the things that I've also appreciated in, say, Grand Ridge Plaza or something like that is also having that other entryway. I mean, we have weather. If you're going to have a parking lot and somebody's going to park there, they should be able to also enter in that way. So I might change that to say inappropriate if the only entry.
So there wouldn't be any only entries because your primary entries cannot be from a parking lot. This is a comment or a question that we've asked a number of times and haven't really had an opportunity to sit down and get down to this level of response. But it is, all I can say is it was an intentional choice by Crandall or Ambula to not make that change. So that's not contradicting what you're saying. It's just giving you as much perspective as I have on it.
Okay.
I actually like what you said. because she's right. When you're parking your car and it's raining, it's like, I want to get inside, and I may not necessarily care so much what it looks like as long as it gets me inside.
Yeah.
So is there,
Can we at least address that with CA and?
no. Then actually, I was going to discuss exactly what Joan mentioned about the spaces on the roofs. I noticed that piece was missing as far as open community spaces and green spaces on rooftops.
So that's addressed in the Central Issaquah standards. It isn't required, so let me just be clear. It is encouraged, and we certainly are supportive of it, and we have a couple of projects that have taken advantage of it. The only thing I can tell you is that from a building code perspective, it is more complicated to have that on the roof.
So Lucy, I'm doing this from really bad old memory, pre-vacation memory. So is there not something within the natural context piece that talks about step backs and green activity spaces on the roof?
So buildings in the enclosure section and in the setback, step back area, buildings over a certain height have to step back, and those would be terraces. But that wouldn't I mean, it could be green, it is not required to be green.
Can we also talk about those heights? When we're looking at the chart, is that, and I'm not on the right page, so I'm of course not going to reference it well, but it says things like, yeah. Wait,
Sorry,
you
I know,
passed it?
there it was.
Yeah, so like in the right column, when we're talking about height or stories or whatever that is, that's way too small for me to actually read. I believe it says like 4+ stories. So is that a minimum or a maximum?
Oh, so
for Northwest Contemporary stories, it says 4+ stories, you know, just using that as an example for all across. Some of them say max, some of them say like 2 to 5 floors.
Right.
What does that mean?
Well, for instance, arts and crafts has a range because different uses have different heights. So commercial would be different than residential, so I think that's why they put the range in. I think that, so I'm going to try something because I do that kind of thing. When we were talking about the last style, I made a kind of little crib sheet on heights because that was one of the policy questions that we were hoping to discuss with you. And so I put in the min and the max as I understood it.
Okay. And now we've got one additional, the Northwest Contemporary, right?
No.
Revival.
Northwest Revival. These are all traditional Issaquah styles. You are right, there is Northwest Contemporary, but that's for the urban core, and this was relative to traditional Issaquah. There was a lot of discussion by the Development Commission, by the council, the public, and staff about whether we needed another style, and so we have another style. And if we want to talk about this, I can sort of frame it a little bit.
Well, I guess the question, kind of the thing to address here is, do we feel comfortable with all of those heights? Is there, and some of those are pretty tall.
So I think the chart below, the table 4.4, is the allowed heights. So our task was not to evaluate heights in the different districts. Our task was to look at the architecture and urban design. So we have focused on what is appropriate to implement table 4.4. So as you can see, outside the urban core, the heights are, the max height using density bonus is 65 feet, except in mixed use, it is 85 feet. Those would translate into 65 would be somewhere between 5 and 6 stories. 85 feet would be somewhere between 7 and 8 stories, depending on the use.
Okay, so if I'm interpreting that correctly, that means then that the Northwest Revival, you're saying, is only going to be appropriate in areas that have at least that height capacity.
Well, okay, I'm backing up. So I think the question is, what minimum and maximum heights should be applied to this? For instance, the 10 stories that CA recommended is probably beyond the heights allowed in those zones. And in one place, they said the minimum height was 5 stories. In another place, they said it was 6 stories. So the administration is recommending, kind of as a range for discussion, either 4 to 5 as a minimum or 7 to 8 as a maximum, given the heights that are allowed in traditional Issaquah. And I would just add that the pictures at the bottom, this commercial style that Northwest Revival represents, these are buildings in Issaquah that, although 2 stories, are built in this commercial style. The building on the right where Vinabello is the Coott, C-O-U-T-T, I've never heard it said, building. The Issaquah Bank building is the one on the left, and the middle picture is what it looked like originally.
Wow.
I just like to show that because I was really blown away when I saw that, how it had been transformed. So those represent, especially in original form and the Coott building, are both classic examples of the commercial style that they are proposing as part of Northwest Revival. So back to our meaty slide. So there is a range of uses or a range of styles. The only style that initially had gone above 4 stories was Northwest Lodge. The arts and crafts style has been modified by CA to have 5 stories, but we still have the potential of buildings that are taller than that. And so that's why we asked for the Northwest Revival. That was part of the instigation for the Northwest Revival style. And so this style came in on Thursday night. So the Development Commission had not had an opportunity. That was another reason that we thought it was important to have them here, because they were a big part of the instigation in asking for this other style, and it seemed appropriate to have a roundtable discussion.
I've also got a question, more about materials, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. So is this a good time to bring this up?
Well, there you go.
All right, so I see the use of simulated wood as acceptable, and I understand simulated wood can take on many different forms. What I see that up in Highlands is the use of some simulated wood is already delaminating. Fiberboard, particle board, it's soaking up, it's rotting, it's coming off the buildings, it's warping. It looks terrible. Would it be appropriate to say that type of material is not appropriate in this document, or would that be more of a code?
So it actually, so that language was added at the direction of DC through a conversation about the original proposal was natural materials only. And I think part of the conversation that we had at DC was to have some more flexibility for things like hardy plank and other materials that are in current construction, but yet have that appearance of durable material. So I think the intent was, if it's synthetic, it would emulate a durable material. I am not aware of the construction issues that you're identifying in the Highlands and what kind of materials are experiencing that lack of durability. So I think
Sarah, I have checked in with Sarah Hoy, and I didn't remember till you were, I saw your email, but I did not remember your previous comment. I've got to go back and look. Sarah Hoy, the executive director of the Issaquah Highlands Community Association, told me more about that. It's a very specific material. It is not, I think it would be unfair to paint all simulated wood with that brush, but I can find out more about the specific example that you've identified, Ron, and we can identify that, because I don't think we want something that's not going to be durable.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm not saying all simulated wood. I'm just saying there are certain varieties of simulated wood that would be disastrous 15, 20 years of use. Yeah, I can imagine the urban core being built using a lot of these materials, and after 20 years, it would look terrible.
Right. I think to your point, I think rather than identifying certain brands, because as you know, we learn about durability based on time, and you may have a belief like that Trex is a very durable product, but then we might find out that no, actually it may not last as long as we think it might. So part of this is identifying the intent, which is if it's synthetic, that it's a proven durable product, I think is what the intent was of allowing synthetics.
I'm not the subject matter expert on that, but I wanted to bring that up as an important criteria.
So when you are looking at the plant, the proposal from a developer, and they have a specific synthetic material that they're going to use, you would have the option to say, show me the history, the whatever?
Well, I say, no, I don't, in terms of what we approve, we wouldn't get into essentially like building code approval of whether something's an appropriate, but whether it meets the guidelines of the design, architectural design, not
Okay.
for us to be able to say, this is a material that won't last.
But, I think the important thing to add is this, as much as this was created as an important toolkit for the Development Commission, it is a tool that staff are also going to be implementing. And, the commission sees material boards, they approve them, but we are also behind the scenes, looking at things at a finer grain than the commission will based on the codes that are adopted. So I think that's trying to find a more generic term, not a as Keith said, not a specific product that is not being allowed, but to try and identify what those kind of durable materials are that are acceptable. Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
And Mr. Foll, one of the things that I personally think is an improvement in this process that will result from this is that I know you've attended some Development Commission meetings, and you're, as such, you're probably aware that there have been some, as in more than one, application where the Development Commission has specifically asked for more material to be used that is representative of the Northwest, more natural material, more stone and wood. And the issue is that we asked and suggested strongly, and because it was a suggestion from us and it wasn't in the list of materials that can be used in this type of district, which is what the design manual is going to do, we didn't get it.
What's the plan to finish the document? I know it's stamped final draft all over the place, but there's a lot of tweaks that still need to happen, and to me, there's a lot of holes as far as the inappropriate examples. We have a lot of yellow question marks throughout the document of saying, still need to provide this, and to me, that's where a lot of our teeth is to be like, this is what we don't want. Is that still in the works? Is that done but just not added to the document, or?
There are maybe 2 or 3 locations in which we have asked for inappropriate examples to maybe be identified. I would say that the, the majority, if not all of what is left to be done is, for instance, cleaning up the InDesign, fixing some of the numbering. I think that there are relatively minor things left to be done. I don't feel that the 1 or 2 or 3 locations of inappropriate is significant, but that's my opinion.
Has it been done then? I mean, if they're not significant, then that means that you've found details to include, we just don't have them?
I would not say that. We have asked for that to be added, and again, have not had an opportunity to sit down and understand. Crandall and Rambula may feel that those are not necessary, that there isn't particularly a good example of inappropriate examples. Sorry, I'm repeating my words.
Okay, I guess then I would encourage completion of that. I think that that's really important to show language showing this is not what we want. I have one example that is on page 60 of 147, where the inappropriate is a facade projection except a balcony, and you give an inappropriate picture. And I found it to be a little bit vague, and so if that's what you're considering to be inappropriate, which, I mean, I can see that it is a larger.
Could you give me the page number again, Joy?
Yeah, 60 of 147.
Thank you.
And so, I mean, at some point, then I shouldn't actually have a height maximum of saying, for this false front Western style, this is how big it should be. There should actually be a range of specifying it, because right now it feels a little subjective to say oversized. And so we have, the language on B is just the facade projection being inappropriate. Yeah, we don't really actually have a specification of how far is too far. And then you can, see on, pages 98 and 99, provide examples, question mark. And I think that's pretty, important to say for our building edging we talk about. We have a lot to talk about as far as awnings, what materials can be used. We don't want polyester awnings, or how much we want them to project over because of weather. But then we don't have what is an inappropriate building edge for setbacks. So I think that this document needs to be finished. I don't think we need to necessarily see that, but having it just remain a blank to me is a little bit of concern. So I would encourage that.
Okay, and let me speak to a couple of the examples that you've identified. One of the things that has come out of some of the legal world is that a photograph is as valuable as the words. So I think that that's the reason that, for instance, the example that you identified in the Western Falls Front, even though there's not a specific number, I think that there is sort of a proportional description between the words and the image. That was acceptable. We have tended to use numbers, but because it is a proportional situation, it may not have been a number may not have been the right approach. There is, with the weather protection, the Central Issaquah standards still exist, and these complement those. And so one of the decisions with weather protection was, for instance, to have the more design elements, such as the materials, the image, the sort of character of those, be in this document, whereas the dimensional requirements remains in Central Issaquah standards, so that they complement each other. So I think that dimension has been addressed. It's just not in this particular document.
Okay.
And I appreciate, let's look at the, right. This was, so this is one of the examples where staff, put this in as a placeholder because we need to have that conversation with Crandall Rambula, and we can follow up, and it's helpful to know that you would find that useful.
Thank you.
So I have a question and a suggestion. To Joy's point, if we go back to 60, so using the picture in the bottom right-hand corner, your suggestion is to use the spirit of the vision to mitigate that type of structure, those type of additions. Yet that still leaves a lot of ambiguity and subjectivity. So if a developer came in and wanted to do something similar to that, there isn't anything definitive that would say you cannot do that.
So, well, it has been identified as inappropriate. And so let's say the developer came in and showed this. And I would look at this and say, this has been identified as an inappropriate example, and the cornice is approximately half the size of the facade below it. And that's what you're showing, and so that has already been deemed to be inappropriate. You're right, it doesn't say 5 feet's okay and 6 feet isn't, but that is with buildings that can vary from 1 to 6 stories, or no, 1 to 4 stories. A dimensional, a dimension may not be appropriate.
Right, and I certainly understand that, but the argument is, how do you actually regulate that? Who would be the one who would be able to decide whether or not that was appropriate? A developer comes and says, that's great.
You will.
On the commission.
That's why we're so famous.
So staff would take the first whack at it. We fill out the checklist first. So actually, the applicant fills out the checklist first. And the applicant would say, I chose Western Falls Front, and I meet all the standards. And we go through and we say, well, no, we don't think you do because this is disproportionate. Ultimately, then that gets forwarded to the Development Commission. Development Commission get to see that staff don't believe it's appropriate. Now, the applicant would then say, here's what it says, here's why I think it's appropriate. They ultimately then they're the decision maker, so they then get to decide. If the applicant, let's assume they agree with staff, and they require that extension to be reduced a certain amount, the applicant then has the ability to appeal that decision. So there is a process. So now we're back to procedural due process. There's a process associated with that. If that then goes to the hearing examiner, and the hearing examiner agrees with the Development Commission that they made the appropriate decision, then the applicant then gets to appeal that to Superior Court if he wants, and then we're back to a place that we've been before. So part of this is getting as many of those ambiguities knocked down as appropriate. Is this one where we might want to take a second look and maybe provide some additional clarity? Maybe. I don't know. But I hear the point. I'm not sure. I feel super comfortable at this moment on that particular one example of inappropriateness. But you know, I know that Lucy's been having conversations with the city attorney, and I don't know if there's something else coming for this or not. But I think we're on the same page as you are. We want clarity. I think the Development Commission wants as much clarity as they can get out of it. There will be places where we've probably not provided enough, and we'll have to come back and add photos, and if not, more text.
Yeah, I don't think that there needs to necessarily be a height requirement, but it's to me just an example of saying, you know, Lucy's words I think were, well, if it's double the size, then that means it's too big. And so just having even that kind of bracketing, I think helps developers, especially when we have these blanks of what is inappropriate. So that's why I just call out of saying, the better we define what we don't want, I think it helps to direct what we do.
This is just a comment about the photos. So I think the photos are very helpful, and as you said, they're also helpful from a legal standpoint when the wording isn't as precise. But I also particularly liked the Issaquah photos. There are a lot of photos from within Issaquah, and I think that if they could replace some of the photos that aren't from Issaquah with Issaquah photos, I think that would be extra helpful, just because it would help also the developers. They can then model after things that they could actually see in the community, and it would also, I imagine, help make the community more cohesive, because the examples are actually examples existing here.
So they're all looking at me because we had this conversation with the
okay.
Development Commission.
And they're mostly from Issaquah, which I think is great, but then they're, you know.
There are some that are. We did a Issaquah building survey of non-residential buildings that are 2 or more stories with the Development Commission and pass that along. I think that in the time frame that we had, they were, plus I did not provide them with new photos. I asked them to let me know which ones they thought were good examples that we, other than the library, which we were all very clear would be in here. So I think that is something that we will be following up with them to replace some of the pictures or add to some of the pictures, because I agree with you. While it has really helped, these are great pictures, they're clear, they're well lit. It's always nice to have projects you can actually go walk around, that experiencing them in 3 dimensions is different than looking at a picture. And so that will be something that we'll follow up with them.
Okay,
One of the major points we tried to make with the consultant was that we didn't want all of the Issaquah photos to be inappropriate. We would hardly agree with you that we felt very strongly the same way. Lucy and her staff did a great job of putting Issaquah photos together, and very few of those made it in there, and unfortunately, so I'd like to see many more.
I think also there's an aspirational aspect to this too, because we're talking about what we, specifically for the urban core, which is going to go up by definition. And so we don't have a lot of up in the urban core yet, so what do we want them to look like? And that's why the examples, a lot of the examples there are from Portland, where CA is, but they've got that there, and it's pretty hard to find Northwest contemporary 5-story buildings in Issaquah that we want to see more of. And I would say one other thing to Commissioner Fall's point. This is one of the perennial challenges of the Development Commission, in that we want creativity, as one of the members of the public mentioned tonight, and we've had some real active discussions on how do you have standards and code for height and things like that, and then go to this in this direction without stifling creativity, without having some architectural presentation to us that really is neat and oh, by the way, code compliant, but it wouldn't have been before. So when it comes to the facade heights and things like that, I think that's one of the reasons that we're not getting into specific numbers and trying to go more with pictures of what we think works and what doesn't work.
Okay, well, but now, not to imply that we should be wrapping up or anything like that, but looking at the clock and looking at where we are, I think with the discussion, do we want to make the suggestion to continue this conversation at a later time so we can dig into this and allow the city staff to make changes and so on?
I haven't heard any major changes. What changes would they be? I mean, specifications, clarifications, but no.
Additions?
I think, I feel from my perspective, Ron, I think I have one question and one comment left, and I'm ready to move forward. I don't know that I need a further roundtable discussion to continue at a later date, but that's just from my perspective that I'm.
Isn't there, but, correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't you interested in adding another design standard to this?
All the design standards are in the draft that you received.
It's in there as an amendment.
Okay, okay, now I understand.
Madam Chair?
Joy, what's your question?
Oh, I had a question about, the very last section is on context. And at first I was questioning when I read the document, because I was reading it obviously front to back, why it was kind of put as, it felt like an afterthought. And I kind of was questioning at first why it was put at that place in the document. And then I realized I cared less about where it was in the document and the fact that I thought this was a really important part when we talk about trying to take in something aspirational and actually put some teeth on it. It's on page 141 of 147. And the line that strikes me is the end of the first paragraph, where it says, simply put, new development should fit in with the environment and vision for Central Issaquah. And I thought, wow, that's exactly what we want. We want to step back and feel like this is cohesive rather than a bunch of puzzle pieces put together, especially in the core. When we have a lot of development coming. And so I guess I just, my question is kind of about this, why this element is put here. And then I think my further comment is to kind of say, is there a way to kind of expand this and make this a little more integral into the document? Because to me, this is, it feels a little more important than the way it's addressed. Does that make, I don't know if that makes sense.
So I'm going to go back and actually, I love how much you guys challenge me in terms of making a presentation. Okay, so let me say a couple things about the urban design section. So, you know, a big piece that we hadn't addressed was architecture. Clearly, you guys have no questions on the structure of architecture, so I'm not even going to go back there. But on urban design, I think what you're bringing up is an interesting point. And it took me a little bit of time to understand the way they were thinking about it. And here's what I'd like to say is that there are two broad categories. There is context and there is site. Context is how does the project fit into the setting, and site is obviously the specific site. And I think that the reason that it is here, Joy, is because it applies to all styles in all districts. So they've set up the districts, they've explained this sort of fine-grained thing. Then what they're saying is, what are the things that are ubiquitous, generic, spread over everything in a consistent sort of way? And so, you know, in context, they have the natural context piece, which is the one we'd like to discuss a little bit more with you. The other is other buildings. And what they've said is the majority of buildings need to harmonize. The way they harmonize is using the styles. Civic and cultural buildings are the ones that will stand out. And I would add to that the sort of parks and plazas, I think, will be an important piece. The site itself, then there are a number of pieces about how that site contributes to building a pleasant, pedestrian-oriented public realm. So there's this sort of bundle, this basket of things, which they chose for whatever reason to make second, that applies to everything, as opposed to the architecture, which is parsed in a much more fine-grained way. Does that help?
It does help, except for when I look back to the design review checklist and I've seen, you know, natural content, and the context section, does it apply? It's almost like the no category needs to be crossed off. It needs to apply, you know, so the way that I read the document, it felt a little more like I get that it's a bigger bucket that applies to everything, but it also felt important to me, and maybe it didn't stand out quite as much as there was something that resonated with me about how it was kind of, whether it was at the end of the document or whether it was just a shorter section. To me, it was important.
I'll agree with Joy there. I like the idea of that beginning context section of the urban design almost being in, I'll have to go back to the very beginning of it, but kind of before the architecture section in the introduction. Just because that's such an important element of, here's why we're doing it, here's what this means for developers, and here's the context that we're going to be reviewing these projects.
Well, I guess then what I'm hearing is, so, you know, this is page 2, and it has, so what I'm hearing is that some of the language of potentially the description I gave you and the language that CA is using at the beginning of chapter 3 should be pulled into this page to set up that framework a little better. Is that what I'm hearing?
I'd almost rather it be repetitive and that's restated again, if you want to keep that context at the end so it feels more umbrella-like. And maybe it's just a matter of going through this design review checklist, and maybe there is just no boxes, the note boxes aren't, you know, if it has to apply. If it doesn't apply, then that's an issue. That's a stall.
Well, I
like the idea of there being aspirational stuff in chapter 1 rather than leaving that to chapter 3.
Okay. So under I think there's some pieces like building edges that are probably going to apply to all projects.
I think it's just the context. So if you're looking at that,
Oh,
just
okay.
the context portion,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
site, and that would stay.
Yeah, it's
There's
just
just something
in
about
terms of
that
the-
that is.
So, but that natural areas will not apply to every project.
So, but I think, I mean, so if you think about it, I guess I agree to some extent with the commissioners, and you guys, unless you went back and looked at all the DC meetings, which I assume maybe you did not. One of the first things out of our consultant's mouth was, it's important for buildings to fit into the environment, and that goes contrary to what most architects want to do, which is to build the most impressive building that they can for their client. And so that particular issue was key to everything that spun out from there, right? That's why there's specific architecture types that they can choose from, not just a complete open architectural palette, right? And so I think putting something in the introduction that says that that was one of the kind of the cornerstones or the capstones to the whole structure for this, I think that's great, because I think that's the way they led, was because it was a hard thing to kind of hear at the beginning, but it was very key to how they put this whole piece, this puzzle together, which is, you know what, buildings should blend in with their surroundings, and they shouldn't necessarily be the point of attention for that particular block, unless they have a particular use that warrants that. And that was I think, very pivotal to the whole conversation. So I think that can be done. I think that is not contrary to the way that I think they heard the messaging.
Well, and I think that, especially in looking at page 2, that it seems a little light on
Brief,
explaining.
yeah. I like the idea of really expanding, I think we all gravitate towards that concept and really just hitting it home off the bat.
Right. The architecture probably needs less description, but the context, I think, could benefit to help users understand the distinction between the two chapters.
It elevates the tone of the document.
Okay.
Well, and it sends a message out that, the building that you just built in Vegas, you're not going to be able to build here up at the front, right? And I think that's a message we all want people to start with.
I think.
It sounds more like Issaquah. I mean, it encapsulates Issaquah and brings some of the other people into this.
Is there any discussion, as we go back to this kind of hard versus blurry line as far as styles in the urban core? It sounds like we're all pretty happy with the traditional styles that are in front of us. Is there any discussion about wanting to expound or keep right now what we have for the urban core?
I think I'm a little bit concerned with there only being one option there, and for such a large area of the city. And Joan, I heard what you said about how, it can be interpreted a lot of different ways. Maybe devoting a little bit more space to some of those different options within that one design standpoint as a way to show some differentiation, instead of necessarily bringing one of the other design styles into the urban core or defining a seventh piece.
So would that be more images that would show that diversity?
Think so?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That would help.
I like that idea. Good.
Yeah.
One question about that would be that some of the limitations would be that you cannot have eaves or overhangs getting it mixed up, but in the urban core, your buildings would not be able to have eaves or overhangs on a building, which may be fine, but would mean that no buildings would have that. And I don't know if that's an area that needs to be that strict in the guidelines, or?
That's a good point, because isn't that the area where we're trying to create mixed-use development to get people to walk around? And if we're not going to have overhangs, that's...
I'm sorry, I think this would be like at the top of the building.
There's still weather protection.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
got it.
What the text says is minimal to no eaves and overhangs. And Remember, I mean, there's a character piece, and I think that's partly what you're speaking to. You were speaking, there's an architectural and a sort of design character, and then there's functionality. You know, at 4+ stories, what's happening at the top of the building in terms of functionality? It's a decorative piece.
But you're referring to awnings and things like that at
Yes.
the lower levels,
Right, which would be there.
included in this
Yes.
discussion.
Right, because weather protection is in that urban design section that applies to everything.
Sure. I have a couple questions here. One on the page 33, bottom left-hand corner, third paragraph. Could you clarify exactly what that intent is?
Can you tell me what I saw your email.
It says the urban core is located centrally, and while it may be influenced by the urban core zoning district, kind of one and the same though, right?
So, there is the urban core zoning, like any other zone that you have in the city. And then there's the urban core design manual district.
Got it.
So they have the same name, and they're in the same location.
Okay. That looked a little ambiguous to me. But thank you for the clarification.
Absolutely.
I also see something that looks like is lacking in this document. I see throughout the document the mention of that sometimes steel doors or metal doors. I think I saw steel doors. I just don't want to see aluminum doors showing up. I saw steel, and I was referencing thinking, I wonder if they thought about aluminum doors and aluminum windows. Okay, never mind. And is there any restriction on colors?
Yes.
Okay, how restrictive is
White,
that?
very restrictive.
We want it that restrictive.
So
Yeah.
let's
Let
look
me
at
just
the-
say Atlas blue.
Yeah.
Like Atlas Blue.
So, and I'm not speaking personally. I think the message from the community, from the Development Commission, from the council is Atlas blue is not what we want. And that the color palettes that are identified in here are, I don't think they will be monotonous, but they will be narrower.
So toward that idea, within the glossary of terms, which in this addendum is page 123, 124, there's a really good explanation for earth tones, hue, tint, and tone, along with a color wheel. And I feel like that needs to be, there needs to be a link between that very specific information and what's included in each of the design styles.
So you may notice that every single color page was replaced along with this section, and that was to take the term hue, which is specifically defined through the glossary and this color wheel, and specifically link it to the inappropriate color term. And that was very important to the city attorney, as well as the inclusion of a couple of the inappropriate pictures in the glossary to ensure that there was greater clarity of what was inappropriate.
Yeah. So I think what I would want, both for the Development Commission and for developers, is maybe another color wheel or some kind of definition in visual terms of earth tones. And then just every time we're mentioning color in each of the design areas, referring them to this page or this glossary, so that, because you're not going to include that visual multiple times in the document, but being very specific about what the difference is there.
So I'm going to set the earth tone piece aside for just a moment. But in good code writing, you don't do that.
You don't do that? Yeah.
And
Okay.
the reason is, if we call out one thing and link it back to the glossary, and we don't do that with everything, it implies certain things about what we're saying or not saying.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's why the terminology is exact. And that is then staff's responsibility to say, you know, see, it says hue here as an inappropriate color. That's defined in the glossary. So that's how that would play out. In terms of earth tones, let me make this bigger for my eyes, if not for yours.
I liked, Lucy, how in the document you defined Pickering red as being okay here and not okay here, because I saw it as being a nice definition of where do we allow our hue to be, kind of a thing. I thought that was well put.
And the Development Commission deserves all credit for Pickering red. That was, I think, really a wise thing that they did, was to specifically call out that color. You know, Lindsay, I can ask them about that. I will tell you that we've spent a lot of time on this. That doesn't mean that we've got it right. But we started with natural colors, and my point was, you know,
Blue in the sky is natural.
exactly, that Atlas blue is sky blue, and that's natural, and that's not what we want. So I know that they spent a lot of time trying to look at terms. And I think the thing I would say is I can go back and look at I know that they very specifically picked
Yeah, that
earth
section
tones.
reads really well, and I think it has a lot of clarity to it. I like visuals, but that's just me. So I could see it either way. I really like the visual that's given to the hue versus
I get that.
tint and tone. And so if there was any way to demonstrate that as well for the earth tones, I think that would be great.
Okay.
Joan, I think.
I have,
If you don't mind, I'd like to just point out, Lucy had brought up the question before about the Northwest Revival style, that we had not seen that, and that we may want to provide our opinion on that from the Development Commission perspective. First, I would say, and Richard and I have talked before, I think, I like the Northwest Revival as a possible use, a style to be used. A couple things. One would be, Lucy did bring up the suggestion that she had of changing the height, and I think was looking for direction on how to go with that. With 85 feet, and I think it's in the Northwest Revival, you're required to go, it's 15 to 20 feet in the first floor. You really couldn't go above 7 stories, so I think 7 as a max works. And I think she said 4 or 5, and I think with 4 you could still get a tripartite design. So I think a 4 to 7 height limit with that, I think would work for that as in response to that. It does bring up one other issue I think is here, is buildings over 5 stories, we now have 2 choices, but only 2. We have Northwest Lodge and Northwest Revival. Northwest Revival has to be a brick, stone covered building. Northwest Lodge, the images are very much lodge style. One of the big designs you would see would be a 5/2 multifamily mixed-use design, 2 floors of commercial on the bottom and concrete, and 5 floors of wood frame above that. You typically can't do more than 5 of wood frame. That would put you at 7 stories. In the mixed-use zoning, which is quite a bit of the traditional area, that would typically, I think, be what we would be seeing come down the road, would be a 5/2, which would only allow the lodge and revival, which I kind of question whether you could fit a design in lodge or revival style in a 5/2 type of building. I think there are a lot of examples of very attractive 5/2 buildings that would work in Issaquah. We've seen in Issaquah that don't meet those 2 styles, and raises a concern for me.
what would be your suggestion?
I wish they would have come up with another one, another style for that size, or if arts and crafts could be interpreted if you went up to 7 stories, or I don't know if that works, but I would look maybe more to Lucy and her team to try to figure out a style that would be a modern Issaquah 5/2 apartment that meets what we want to see in Issaquah. And I'm not sure that fits in those two, but if there's another style for that.
Would Urban Grange be able to be amended for that? I tend to think about how Urban Grange style has been applied in like Wenatchee for larger scale buildings, and it kind of integrates some of the comments that we had heard tonight about kind of more of a Northwest industrial, kind of mixed with a little bit of an old school, and I think Urban Grange might be able to, if we were able to. That might be one way to go.
I don't know if that takes into account the 5 stories as
Well, right here, they're 2 and 4, but I don't know if they're.
Right, that's a good point, Lindsay. I mean, barns probably pushing, 4 stories, maybe 5, but given the overall sort of profile of the building, I'm not sure that it addresses the 5/2. The lodge style, I mean, there is some, I think there are some ways in which 5/2 would work with lodge, because the way it is described is with a heavy base, lighter above. So, having a, and bipartite. So, having a 2-story base of some kind of masonry or concrete with the 5 stories above, I think isn't inconsistent. And it would have a pitched roof, which, if you're doing a mixed use with residential, for instance, that also could be appropriate. I will tell you that coming up with this style was quite a feat. And I don't know that there is another style that I would recommend.
Do you think we would be able to have them come up with pictures of 5/2 multifamily that would fit the lodge style the way they talk about it? And
that's a good point just in general. If we look at the Development Commission, you guys say, okay, these are the most common types of development that we get in Issaquah, or that we want to get in Issaquah. As an example, the 5/2, let's make sure there are pictures that address that wherever it's applicable to the height, because gosh, if we're going to be providing pictures, the more pictures that we can provide that are applicable in addition to aspirational are great.
I think it was very appropriate, because like pictures of Claylock Lodge, we're not going to get Claylock Lodge built in downtown Issaquah. So.
What?
So, and while we're on these topics here, I do have 3 additional, 2 questions here. One, I didn't see anywhere in this document about the use of reflective tinted windows. I don't know if that would be part of the document or
No,
part of the
it
code.
isn't. Actually, it isn't here. It's very specifically prohibited.
Okay, excellent. And then my next question is utilities, and the utilities go a couple different directions. One would be street lighting, if there would be different type of street lighting for different areas. And then 2, the use of satellite dishes and cellular towers and other types of communication devices that would be on buildings. If that would be part of the design or if that would be part of code. And then you have utilities such as HVAC systems and so on, if those would be visible.
So utilities are addressed in the Central Issaquah standards.
Okay.
And we asked Crandall Rambula if they felt additional standards were necessary, and I assume that since they didn't add anything in here, they feel that what we've got in the Central Issaquah standards is sufficient. What it requires is that rooftop systems be screened, and that would include, cell towers and other kinds of equipment on the roof. In terms of streetlights, the specific styles of streetlights is not defined. We are working with Public Works Engineering as different projects have taken place in different parts of town to identify a street light for the corridor or for the district. So that has been, we've been working on that incrementally with Public Works Engineering, Public Works Operations, and PSE.
So that would be baked into this document?
No, it doesn't have, I mean, it's our right-of-way, and so it's really a plan that we need to have to be able to make it easy to work with applicants. But we don't have to put it into this particular document to be able to specify what kind of street fixtures to use.
Understood. Okay, excellent. Thank you.
One last round. Anybody else want to?
So there was one other policy conversation which we haven't had, which is about the natural areas. Do we want to talk about that or not?
What conversation?
Yeah.
What elements should be included in the natural areas and the extent of response to those?
So this document seems to suggest that you need to have windows and things like that oriented toward the natural environment, that you can't have a parking lot between the building and the natural environment, all things like that, which, and the materials need to address.
Right, so so we weren't questioning that list, which is this sort of the things that are listed under with the bullets down here, building materials, open articulation uses, site access, site uses. I think the two questions were, the map that CA showed included some things that we don't think probably make sense. And two, there was quite a bit of discussion, both with the council and with the Development Commission, about, for instance, if you have four classifications of streams, do you make the full set of responses for all of those? Or does a class 4 stream does it have a different level of response than, say, a class 2 or 1 stream?
Can you give us an example?
Yeah. I mean,
right. So it could be that. So one example would be the buildings step back when they're next to this natural area. You might say with the highest level buildings step back, with a class 4 stream, they don't step back. I am not a proponent. I think we are fine. The administration is fine with having all of these, but we put that out as a policy discussion because even though we have put this forward and the administration is comfortable with this, there was not clarity by the Development Commission, there's not clarity by the council, and it seemed as a planning policy commission that might be something you want to discuss. It may not be, and that's fine.
Where would that be applicable?
So this is the map that Crandall Arambula proposed. It would need to be updated because some of the green areas shown are actually development parcels. So we are not using this map to take away the development rights of certain properties. We do think that there are certain things that might be appropriate. Wetlands, critical areas, streams, and their buffers. I think we all feel that that is an important part of the green necklace and that level of response is appropriate. Another would be stormwater facilities. You know, the ponds at Pickering Place they're stormwater ponds, but they have a very natural character. They have trails. It would seem appropriate to do that. Engineered ponds, maybe that isn't appropriate. Those might be redeveloped in the future when projects redevelop. Maybe we don't do that for those. Hillsides. They had proposed hillsides. We had removed, the administration proposed removing hillsides. If this is not of interest, I'm getting a very interesting set of faces.
I don't know. I don't know how that actually fits into this.
And I have a specific question, but to that, which is on the last slide, it said that the responses are on part UD 1.1.1. Yeah. And where is that in our, I just couldn't find that.
Sure.
Because I'm having trouble understanding what the proposed responses that we're talking about are.
So can I maybe try, Lucy? So
Since I am getting funny
all right.
faces, yes.
So right now, the way that they proposed the document was if your project is next to an open space, that your design should reflect that as an amenity and not just turn your back on it, right? And so one of the questions that Lucy was saying is, are all of those open spaces equal? Like, so for example, if you're next to Issaquah Creek, so let's take Issaquah Medical Center or Atlas, you know, that's a big amenity. It's you know, it would be hard to just say, oh, I didn't even know it was there. But we have some creeks in town that, you know, for part of the year, they may not have water in them, right? And so it may look even more like a ditch. And so you say, okay, do I treat that the same as I treat Issaquah Creek? Now, what's being proposed in the manual is yes, you do. So yes, you do. And part of it has to do with, is there public access to that open space? So for example, you know, you can take the ponds around Pickering, right? It's actually man-made. It's detention facility, but it looks natural, and there's walking around it, and so the public is invited to enjoy that amenity. So if you're going to build a building next to that, what the manual would say is you should recognize that. There should be step backs, there should be access to the open space, and that's how you handle it. I think the question that Lucy was trying to ask earlier was, is what's in the manual now, where basically if you are adjacent to an open space, your design should reflect that adjacency in some way. You know, I think the administration is fine with that as a holistic approach. But that's part of the conversation point is, do you guys agree with that perspective that, you know, whether it's a ditch or whether it's Issaquah Creek, you should recognize that, hey, it's a critical area and we should pay attention to it when we design our projects.
So we could say yes, and then exceptions could go through the Development Commission.
There aren't any exceptions.
That's, okay, that's where you were saying we have to be, black or white, has to be
predictable.
Predictable and definitive.
Yes.
All right.
So what we had put in here was hillsides and developable property, because some of the land that they showed as green has development rights, would not be included in the map. Stormwater ponds, natural stormwater with ponds with trails would be included, engineered ones would not. Regulated creeks, wetlands, and their buffers would get this special response. City parks, city-owned open space, and private protected property would get this response. But we would treat the map as informational and not regulatory, because I don't think we want to have to go to council every time the city buys a new park, for instance. Or if a project identifies a wetland, then they would have to do that because it's a regulated critical area. We wouldn't need to update the map to show that it's a regulated critical area. So the map would be informational. It would give a sense of some of the things that we're saying we want this response to. But we would establish the things that are in, that you must respond to, and the things that are out that would not require that response.
So when you're talking about that and you say regulated creeks, but then above you've also talked about class 4 streams versus class 2 streams, are those related?
So streams have there are a series of classifications and criteria for those. Again, the administration, other than the things that we've identified at the bottom, because the map bundled a lot of things together, the administration is fine leaving it the way it was. But because there was not clarity coming out of DC, and there was not clarity when we made a presentation at a recent council workshop, we're simply bringing it to your attention. If you do not feel a need or to pursue this further, we're okay with that. We just wanted to include this as one of the policy topics that you could choose to talk about.
You're not really thinking the word clarity, you're thinking of discussion.
There's both clarity, which is the list at the bottom, and then policy, which would be, are all classifications of streams handled the same way? It could be clear either way. It's just a question of what is our policy, what is the result that we want?
Yeah, I would say, at the risk of saying this incorrectly, I'm fine with all the natural features being treated the same, but I like the clarifications that you have there in red.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and if I knew more about Class 2 versus Class 4, maybe I'd have an answer for that and say, well, okay, if something's a ditch 90% of the year, I don't feel like we need to address it. So if there is an obvious response there, I think that's fine as far as the
Well,
streams.
the thing I will say is that many ditches, many things that might to the layperson appear to be a ditch are considered a stream, both from our critical area regulations and the State Department of Fish and Wildlife. And so I don't call them ditches.
So I hesitate for you to think of it as being a ditch, and I would actually be more of a proponent of saying all streams are the same, because basically, depending on the Northwest, what our rainfall has been at any given time, I mean, so giving this kind of classification, I think, is better to just leave everything as being like, yes, we want to have a response to everything, rather than going into a thing of depending on what time of year a developer looks at that and says, hey, but I don't really see a problem, and sticking to that.
I don't think we want ditches, we want landscaped, natural-looking areas, right? So,
Right, and the thing you're calling a ditch is often a
creek.
creek. And then when it is a creek, it is a regulated creek, it has buffers, and those must be landscaped. And so the question is, in addition to the regulatory requirements through the critical area regulations, do we want the site and the buildings to additionally respond? And right now, I think I'm hearing yes.
and
So I would just make one suggested change to the list. I think the developable property is an obvious one that, yes, that should be excluded. But the engineered ponds, I think that potentially engineered ponds are engineered for a reason. They're man-made ponds that are potentially put there to provide habitat for species. So I would suggest that not all engineered ponds are like
Ugly
a retention,
eyesores?
ugly eyesore. I don't think, I mean, that's saying all man-made ponds are ugly eyesores, and I don't think that's the case. So
I agree. I think that
they don't need to be.
first of all, I'd say that historically, they were generally treated as an engineering element and less as this multi-use space like you're describing, Victoria, which I completely concur, that they can have an engineering purpose, but they don't have to look like it, which is the point that Pickering Pond makes very well.
I just wouldn't want to make a developer force their development to have a view over an ugly engineered pond.
Well, and I think the other piece is that if you take the pond that I showed in the upper right, which is at the Fred Meyer Shopping Center, you know, when that shopping center redevelops, that pond may go away. So, I mean, I think that it's not only, it may not be a thing that you want a building to focus on. The other thing is, it may not be something that stays long-term.
and these open spaces, is it for the occupants of the building to appreciate the space adjacent to the building, or is it for the people that are in the space to not be intimidated by a huge building?
So I think it's both. There are, I think it is to have openings and opportunities to have a relationship from inside the building to this natural feature. I think it's for people who, there's a public access requirement or a public access element along this natural feature that would, so that then you want the building to have certain kinds of uses and scale to make it pleasant, a pleasant part of that experience. You know, one side this natural element, the other side a building that has openings appropriate scale, et cetera.
And what you showed us in red is in this document?
No.
Okay, so that would be something you would add to the document.
Right, we would need to clarify that mostly because the map has included some things that would be excluded based on that list in red.
So your suggestion is that we approve this tonight, and then you would come back with this as an amendment that we would approve and bake it in, or what's your strategy?
I think if we approved it tonight, we would approve it with the assumption that this is going to be into it. So they don't have to come back and redo this.
So I think that the language that's on whatever this page is, 85 of 147, is very close to what we described in red. I think we would want to clarify this B statement that says open space shown on the previous page. I think we would want to use the criteria that you saw in red. The map itself would need to be updated because that includes lots of different things. But I think that 95% of what we showed you in that summary slide is the language that's already in this document. We just, now that we've agreed on which elements are going to trigger it, we need to put those elements into this document to finalize it.
Okay. Does that work for you?
Yeah.
Good. So we are looking for an approval of the document. First thing that has to happen is a motion.
I'd like to make a motion to approve the document, approve the, let me use the right title. I'd like to make a motion to approve the final draft 82517 Central Issaquah Architecture Urban and Design Manual.
With the additions of those few additions.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. I just have one question. Do you dream this at night?
Assuming you get to sleep.
Yes, that really.
I do
Dreams
want-
or nightmares?
I do want to compliment
I didn't want to say
you.
that.
Yeah.
So I do want to compliment you on your wealth of information. So obviously, you've done your homework and answered the various questions that have come up. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
I want to say thank you for this document, because I think this is something that our community's needed for a long time.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, but I mean, really, it has been a great team effort. I think the Development Commission has devoted an amazing number of evenings to reading and meeting and discussing this, and it has been hugely helpful because, you know, it is a great community conversation that we have had, and I really appreciate you giving us that high-level picture, helping us sort through some of the last details that we have. That's been really helpful. Thank you.
This really is a,
We definitely appreciate the ability to come in and chat about this.
Yeah, for sure.
this really is a great document. And it shows high-quality workmanship, I mean, throughout it. It's really quite well-written.
And it's a living document. I keep saying that. Because there's, you know, 2 years from now, we could be back here sitting in front of you discussing how to change this document that we're talking about tonight.
We appreciate your work on the front line to show why we need it and how it works, or it doesn't.
Okay. With that, I'm going to call the meeting to close at 9:40.
We haven't even gotten started.
Okay. How are you holding up? Good.